This Brazilian woman says that I surrendered my soul to sleep. The way one deposits a worthless coin into an empty safe. There was no prayer, no sign of the cross, only the weight of my linen sheets and the silence of that isolated house on the Norwegian coast, where the sea struck the rocks like a warning I chose to ignore. The last thing I felt was the smell of salt in the air and the residual warmth of the fireplace. When my eyes opened again, the warmth had been replaced by an absence of temperature so absolute that my lungs seemed to crystallize with the first effort to breathe. I was no longer in my bedroom. I was no longer anywhere that light could reach. Awakening in hell does not happen with trumpets or screams. It happens in a vacuum. I was lying on a surface that resembled crushed graphite, a gray, metallic dust stretching as far as my limited vision could grope into the darkness. The sky above me was not black, but the color of dead rust, no clouds, no stars, and no comfort of the sun. I rose slowly, feeling as though my body weighed twice what it should. My hands, once cared for and soft, now seemed covered by a patina of ancient filth that no water
careful,
could
sometimes
ever remove.
we think we're on the right track
spiritual perception
when
that
we're
struck
not.
me was one of complete moral disorientation. In that place, north and south did not exist, because there was nowhere to go that was different
is
from where I
very
already
clear.
was. I called out my husband's name, but my voice did not echo. It died the moment it left my lips, absorbed by that dense, hungry atmosphere. The silence was so heavy that I could hear the flow of blood in my temples, a rhythmic sound that reminded me I still possessed consciousness, though I did not know whether I still possessed life. I walked a few meters and realized that the landscape shaped itself according to the growth of my anguish. Small hills of ash began to rise, and among them I saw the remains of what looked like fishing boats, but they were carcasses of rotten wood that had never known water. I recognized the carving on one of them. It was the boat my father used, the one I sold out of pure disdain after his funeral, without caring about the livelihood of the men who depended on that vessel. There, in the middle of that polar desert of ash, the wood seemed to weep a black oil that reeked of regret. Loneliness was not merely the absence of people. It was the palpable presence of everything I had discarded. Every selfish decision I made over my 40 years of life seemed to have transformed into an atom of that place. I felt a thirst that was not for water. It was a thirst to be seen, to be forgiven, to have a single second of distraction from the weight of my own existence. But in hell, distraction is forbidden. You are forced to face the architecture of your own soul without the adornments of vanity or the excuses of fatigue.
Sometimes
The cold intensified. It was not a cold that caused shivers, but one that paralyzed the will. I looked back and saw the marks of my feet in the ash. They were disappearing instantly, as if the very ground were trying to erase my passage, denying me even proof that I had been there a second earlier. I was in a village of ghosts where the only ghost was myself, and the reality of my condemnation began to settle on my shoulders like a cloak of lead. I had awakened in the place where the self is the only permitted company, and that self was a monster. I was only just beginning to know. The horizon began to throb with a sickly light, a bruised violet hue that revealed the true scale of that desert. As I moved across the plain of ash, the carcasses of boats gave way to more familiar structures, and for that very reason, far more terrifying. I saw the outline of the care home where I left my mother during her final months. But there it was not made of bricks and mortar. Its walls were composed of layers of scribbled paper, bills, contracts, and every document I prioritized while she withered into oblivion. The smell of ether and dead flowers invaded my nostrils, an olfactory memory I had tried to bury beneath luxury and empty parties. I did not want to enter, but my feet moved under a gravity of their own, a magnetic force generated by the unpaid debts of my spirit. Inside that simulation of architecture, the corridor stretched endlessly. The doors to each room were closed, but from behind every one of them came the sound of heavy, ragged breathing, identical to the one I avoided hearing in the hospital, so it wouldn't ruin my weekend in the mountains. With every step I took, the floor grew softer, as if I were walking on flesh. and I realized that the material beneath my feet was the sum of my neglect. I found the room that should have been hers. When I touched the doorknob, I felt a surge of cold run through my arm as if I had plunged the limb into a frozen lake. The door opened onto absolute emptiness. There was no bed, no mother, only a solitary mirror floating at the center of a roofless room. When I approached, I did not see my reflection. I saw the exact moment I received the call about her death and kept choosing the wine for dinner, feeling a secret relief at finally being free of responsibility. The image in the mirror was vivid, colorful, and warm, which made the gray reality of hell even more unbearable by contrast. The pain of seeing one's own. Indifference is a blade that cuts without drawing blood. I tried to look away, but the mirror followed me. It multiplied into dozens of glass faces, each one showing a different version of myself in which I was the center of my small, selfish universe. I saw my employees being humiliated so I could feel superior. I saw the lies told to gain trivial advantages and the arrogance with which I treated those who had nothing to offer me. Hell did not need demons with whips when I had my own biography to scourge me. I felt a presence at my back. It was not an external entity, but a shadow detaching itself from my own silhouette. It was denser than I was, more real, and it seemed to whisper without using words, injecting thoughts directly into my cortex. It reminded me that I was there, because that was the only place my soul truly felt at home, surrounded by the nothingness I had cultivated. The thirst I had felt before evolved into an internal cramp, a knot in my stomach screaming for a drop of compassion I'd never planted in the world. I ran out of that structure, but the paper house seemed to fold and rebuild itself in front of me, forcing me to traverse the same corridors of neglect again and again. Time there did not have the linearity of seconds and minutes. It had the density of trauma. I could have been there for an hour or for a century. Physical fatigue was impossible, for the body no longer had the limitations of biology. But mental exhaustion was a wall I could not climb. The spiritual realization that I was the architect of that labyrinth was what made me fall to my knees in the metallic dust. I looked at my hands again and noticed that the grime was beginning to seep beneath the skin, turning my veins black. I was becoming part of that landscape. Hell was not merely a destination. It was a slow metamorphosis in which the human fades to make room for the embodiment of its sin. I screamed for mercy, but the word mercy sounded like a foreign tongue I no longer knew how to speak. The rust-colored sky darkened by a shade, answering my despair with an indifference I knew all too well, for it had been my trademark on Earth. The ash-covered ground beneath my knees began to vibrate, a dull tremor that climbed my spine and settled at the base of my skull. I stood up, trying to shake off the dust that now seemed to carry the weight of small fragments of lead. As I walked, the landscape of the fishing village and the care home began to dissolve, replaced by a far more aggressive topography. The scene transformed into a forest of twisted metal, structures that resembled the scaffolding of the construction sites I once managed, but here the iron was incandescent without emitting light, only a dry heat that sucked all moisture from my skin. The metal towers rose like accusing fingers against the purplish sky. Between the beams, I saw hanging shapes that resembled empty clothes, yet they emitted a constant lament, a sound like fabric tearing that replaced the wind. I recognized those forms. They were the dreams and securities of all those I had trampled in my corporate ascent. Each warped beam represented a broken promise. Each loose bolt was a lie I told to secure my year-end bonus. The structure swayed, threatening to collapse on me, but it never did. Hell maintains the constant threat without ever granting the relief of final impact. I tried to find a path through the scrap metal, but the passages narrowed as I advanced. I was forced to crawl through claustrophobic spaces where the hot metal brushed my back, leaving marks that were not wounds, but brands of embers. The spiritual revelation of this stage was an awareness of my pettiness. I, who always prided myself on vast spaces, glass offices and luxurious penthouses, was now confined to the exact dimensions of my selfishness. The world had shrunk to the size of my own lack of generosity. At one of the junctions in that forest of iron, I found a man sitting. His features were blurred, as if he were being erased by the very atmosphere of the place. He held a pen that scratched incessantly at his own arm. When I drew closer, I realized he was one of the accountants. I unjustly fired to cover up a miscalculation that was mine. He did not look at me. He was trapped in his own cycle of self-sabotage and fear, a victim of my ambition, who now served as a mirror of my destruction. I tried to speak to him, to apologize, but the sound that came from my mouth was only the noise of metal, grinding against metal. The inability to communicate was my greatest torment. In the real world, I used words as weapons and shields, manipulating truths to shape reality in my favor. There, language was denied to me, because I never used it to build bridges, only to raise walls. With every attempt to produce a human sound, my chest burned as if I were swallowing embers. I realized that damnation is to a large extent the loss of the ability to connect with another being. I was surrounded by echoes of people, yet more alone than if I were in the vacuum of space. The metal structures began to melt slowly, turning into a viscous, black liquid that ran across the ash-covered ground. The smell of burning rubber and diesel oil became suffocating. I began to sink into that sludge of industrial waste. Feeling the viscosity grip my heels, every movement to free myself dragged me deeper. I looked to the horizon and saw that the sky now displayed flashes of a soundless storm, lightning illuminating the vastness of my isolation. I did not feel hunger or physical exhaustion as we know them, but I felt an ontological fatigue, a weariness of being who I was. The desire to cease to exist was the only prayer I could form. But in hell, existence is the one thing never taken from us. You are condemned to be yourself forever, without the possibility of change, without the mercy of death, and without the hope of a new dawn. The black sludge rose to my waist, and I accepted the embrace of that bitter residue, hoping that the darkness would finally cover me completely. The black sludge did not consume me, but instead transformed into a ground of shattered glass beneath my feet. The scene shifted into a metropolis of mirrors, where the sidewalks were made of unfulfilled promises. Each building reflected a version of my life in which I could have been good, but chose power instead. In every window, I saw the faces of strangers to whom I denied even a simple look of empathy. The rhythm of the narration became a cadence of accelerated heartbeats, echoing against the crystal walls. I realized that the light shining there did not come from a sun, but from the cold gleam of my own vanity, a brightness that exposed every imperfection of my soul. The desert of gold gave way to an infinite library whose books had no pages, only ash. I was the sole reader of a story that had already been written and could not be edited. The tone grew heavy and human, a silent lament for the life I had squandered. I tried to write a new line with my finger in the dust, but the ground opened into fissures of profound loneliness. The revelation here was the acceptance of justice. I was not being punished by an external judge, but by the exact harvest of what I had sown. Mental exhaustion reached its peak when I realized that eternity is consciousness without rest. The end was not an event, but a state of permanence. The final setting returned to that fishing village in Lofoten, but now everything was made of black ice. I saw myself sitting on the same bed where I had slept, but the room had no walls, only the infinite horizon of the abyss. The emotional resolution was complete surrender to silence. I understood that hell is the place where God respects your desire to live without him. I closed my eyes, but sleep never came again. Eternal vigilance began the moment I accepted that I was my own jailer. I awoke in hell and discovered that hell was me.